Welcome back. In the previous video, we added a new state machine with our character aiming like this. And we also used a layered blend per bone with blend weights at 0.75 so that we can still get some of that recoil animation. In this video, we're going to implement a way for her to switch between the hip fire position and the aiming position. So that way, she'll actually look like she's aiming and then going back to not aiming with her animation pose. Now, in order to do that, we need to know whether or not she's aiming from the animation blueprint, which means we can add a variable to the anim instance for aiming. Let's go to shooter anim instance, and let's add a variable for aiming. We'll make a Boolean, and we'll call it beAiming. Now, we're going to need to be able to access this from blueprints, so we'll make a uProperty. We'll make this visible anywhere. We don't want to be able to edit it from our blueprints, and we'll make it blueprint read only so we can access it. We'll put it in the category of movement, just like our other variables, and we'll make it a meta allow private access equals true so that we can access it even though it's a private variable. Now we're going to need to access the shooter character's beAiming variable so that we can set it here in the anim instance. But shooter character's beAiming variable is private. This is a private variable, which means we're going to need to create a getter for this. No problem. We'll go down here to our public section and create a public getter. We're going to make this force inline. It's going to return a bool. It's going to be called getAiming. It'll be const. For obvious reasons, we're not changing anything, and it's just going to return beAiming. Perfect. Now that we have a getter, we can call this from our anim instance. Now in shooter anim instance.cpp, in update animation properties, we need to make sure that we're in the if check for shooter character. So if shooter character is valid, all we need to do is set beAiming equal to shooter character getAiming, that public getter we just created. Now every frame, aiming is updated for our anim instance by getting it from our character. Perfect. Let's compile this. Okay, let's jump back in the editor, and in our animation blueprint, we're going to create another state machine to handle this aiming behavior. So right click, state machine, new state machine, and I'm going to call this hip to aim. Hip to aim. It sounds pretty cool. It sounds like you're really hip if you aim your weapon. So, you're not going to hit anything if you're just spraying your bullets everywhere. It's hip to aim. Anyways, double click on this, and inside hip to aim, we're going to have a couple states. A state for the hip fire pose and a state for the aiming pose. So drag off, create a new state, and call this hip. Drag off of hip and add a state and call this aiming. Now we're going to be able to transition from hip to aiming and aiming back to hip. Now what do we want inside our hip state? Well, we can use cached poses, and if we go back to our anim graph, you'll see that we have a cached pose called cached ground loco with fire. We're going to use that for hip. So go back into hip to aim and into the hip state and right click and say use cached pose ground loco with fire. That's the cached pose data we want to use for hip. Now go back out to hip to aim, and we're going to go into aiming, and what do you think we'll have here? Well, if we go back to our anim graph and look at what's hooked up to the output pose, this is what we get when we're aiming, but it's also blending with cached ground loco with fire. This is her aiming with the gun up to her eye, and when you fire, you get the recoil animation. This is perfect. This is what we need. So we need to cache this off. Let's go ahead and disconnect the pin. And from this layered blend per bone, drag it off, type new saved cached pose, and we can call this aiming ground loco with fire. Because it's ground loco with fire, but it's also aiming. So let's comment this and say ground loco with fire while aiming. That's what we want to use for the aiming state. So let's go back to hip to aim and into aiming and use cached aiming ground loco with fire. And that is our aiming state. Now, what about the transition rules? What do you think is going to go there? Well, we've got that Boolean called be aiming. If we're in the hip state, we want to transition to the aiming state when be aiming is true. So type in aiming and get aiming, plug that in, and then when going from aiming to hip, we're going to get aiming and negate it with a not Boolean. Simple as that. Now back in our hip to aim state, if we click on one of our transition rules, you'll see in the blend settings there's a duration. This is the time it takes to fade between these states. We can make the states blend a little faster by making this number smaller, like 0.1. Let's go ahead and do that for both of them. And so now we have this hip to aim state machine. Let's drag it down here below everything else. And we'll plug this into the output pose. Let's compile and see how this works. And there we have it. When we're aiming, she brings the gun up to her face, and when we're not aiming, it's back down to the hip position. Now there's a bunch of parameters associated with all these, and you can go ahead and tweak parameters here and there till you find something that looks right for your game. Let's go ahead and try firing a bit. This looks great. Notice when hip firing, we get a bit more recoil. And that's because when we're aiming, we're blending between that animation from the firing montage and that idle pose where she's just standing there aiming the gun. So this will conclude this video. We now have the ability to aim, and the animation pose reflects that, and we still get recoil when shooting, whether we're hip firing or aiming. Now, in most games, when you're aiming, it changes the look sensitivity. Because when you're aiming, everything appears closer, and so it'd be easier to hit your target if the look sensitivity was lower. You shouldn't be able to look around so quickly. We're going to take care of that in the next video, so stay tuned.